The old woman stood in the doorway of what remained of her house, her body rigid with fear. Half the roof was gone, blown away by artillery fire 3 days earlier. The walls were pockmarked with shrapnel scars. Her hands trembled as she watched the Canadian soldiers moving through the rubble-strewn street, searching buildings, securing the town. It was April 19th, 1945, and the small town of Frisoith in northwestern Germany had just fallen to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. The fighting had been brief but vicious. German paratroopers had defended every building until the Canadians systematically destroyed their positions. Now, the guns were silent and the occupation was beginning. The woman's name was Margaret Hoffman. She was 62 years old, though she looked older. The war had aged everyone who survived it. She had lived in Frisoith her entire life, raised 5 children in this house, buried her husband in the town cemetery 10 years ago. 3 of her sons were dead now, killed on the Eastern Front. 1 daughter had died in a bombing raid on Hamburg. Her youngest son, barely 17, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm and had disappeared during the final battle. She did not know if he was dead or prisoner or simply gone. She knew only that she was alone in a destroyed town with no food, no water, and an occupying army that she had been taught to fear. For 5 years, the Nazi propaganda machine had filled German minds with horror stories about what Allied soldiers would do when they reached German soil. The Canadians were supposedly savage colonials who showed no mercy, who murdered civilians for sport, who raped and looted without restraint. Margaret had heard these stories repeated until they became assumed truth. She had believed them because she had no reason not to believe them, because the government that told these lies was the only source of information she had access to. Now, watching Canadian soldiers move through her street with rifles ready, she waited for the violence she'd been promised would come. A young Canadian private walked toward her house. He looked barely older than her missing son, with a thin face and tired eyes. He carried his rifle loosely, not pointing it at anything in particular. When he reached her doorway, Margaret took an involuntary step backward, her fear overwhelming her rational thought. The soldier stopped. He raised one hand slowly, palm out, in a universal gesture of peaceful intent. Then, he spoke in badly accented German, clearly struggling with words he had learned from a phrasebook. "No hurt," he said. "Safe now. War over here." Margaret did not respond. She could not process what was happening. The soldier should have been threatening her, should have been searching her house for weapons or valuables, should have been doing any of the terrible things she had been told Canadians did. Instead, he was standing in her destroyed street trying to reassure her, in broken German. The cognitive dissonance was too great. She simply stared at him, her mind unable to reconcile propaganda with reality. The private seemed to understand her fear and confusion. He slowly reached into his pack, moving deliberately so she could see he was not pulling a weapon. He withdrew a can, held it up so she could see it clearly, then set it down on the pile of bricks that had once been her front step. He repeated this action twice more, placing 3 cans in a row. Then he stepped back, gestured to the cans, and said another phrase in his halting German. "For you. Eat." He gave her what might have been intended as a reassuring smile, then turned and walked away to continue his patrol. Margaret waited until he had moved out of sight before approaching the cans. She picked one up with shaking hands and examined it in the weak afternoon sunlight. The label was in English, which she could not read, but there was a picture of meat. It was a Canadian military ration, part of the soldier's own food supply. He had given her his food. The enemy soldier she had been taught to fear had given her his own food. She sank down onto the brick pile, the can still clutched in her hands, and began to cry. They were not tears of gratitude, not yet. They were tears of confusion and exhaustion and the sudden collapse of everything she had believed about what was happening to her country. This scene was repeating itself across northwestern Germany in the spring of 1945 as Canadian forces advanced through towns and villages that had been thoroughly destroyed by war. What made these interactions remarkable was not just that Canadian soldiers were showing mercy to enemy civilians, though that alone would have been noteworthy. What made these interactions extraordinary was that Canadian soldiers were giving away their own food, voluntarily reducing their own rations to feed the people they had just been trying to kill. This was not official policy. This was not ordered from above. This was individual soldiers making individual choices to share what little they had with people who, by all logic, should have been their enemies. To understand why this was so remarkable, you need to understand what the Canadian soldiers had experienced on their way to Germany. They had landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day and fought through the hell of the hedgerows. They had seen their friends cut apart by German machine guns and blown apart by German artillery. They had fought through the Scheldt estuary in the most miserable conditions imaginable, wading through flooded polders while German shells rained down on them. They had pushed through the Reichswald forest in the Rhineland, fighting yard by yard against fanatical resistance. They had seen the concentration camps and the evidence of Nazi atrocities. They had every reason to hate Germans collectively, to view all German civilians as complicit in the horror of the Nazi regime. And yet, confronted with starving civilians in destroyed towns, Canadian soldiers' first instinct was not vengeance, but compassion. This was not universal, of course. Some Canadian soldiers were hardened by combat and felt no sympathy for German civilians, who they viewed as having supported Hitler. Some units maintained strict discipline and prohibited fraternization or assistance to civilians. But across the 2nd and 3rd Canadian divisions that swept through northwestern Germany in April and May of 1945, there were hundreds of documented instances of Canadian soldiers sharing their rations with German civilians, particularly with children and elderly people who were obviously suffering. The official policy of the Canadian military regarding German civilians was deliberately ambiguous. The non-fraternization directive from Allied headquarters prohibited socializing with Germans, but it did not explicitly forbid providing emergency humanitarian assistance. Canadian commanders generally took the position that soldiers should not befriend Germans or treat occupation as a social opportunity, but that preventing starvation was acceptable within the bounds of military necessity. This left enormous discretion to individual soldiers and junior officers to interpret the rules according to their own moral compass. What complicated everything was that the soldiers themselves were not entirely sure how to feel about German civilians. On one hand, they had been fighting German soldiers for months or years. They had seen what the Nazi regime had done, the concentration camps, the systematic murder, the aggressive war that had killed millions. German civilians had supported Hitler, had celebrated his victories, had participated in or at least tolerated the machinery of genocide. There was a strong argument that these people deserved no sympathy, that they had made their choices and should live with the consequences. On the other hand, the soldiers arriving in German towns in the spring of 1945 were confronted with immediate human suffering that was impossible to ignore. Old women who looked like their grandmothers, starving and terrified, children who reminded them of their younger siblings, thin and hollow-eyed with hunger. The propaganda image of Germans as inhuman monsters collapsed when faced with actual human beings who were clearly victims of the war as much as anyone else. These were not SS officers or Nazi officials. These were ordinary people whose lives had been destroyed by a regime many of them had not chosen and could not escape. Private Robert Henderson from Winnipeg found himself face to face with this moral complexity on April 22, 1945, in a town whose name he could never remember. His platoon was clearing buildings, ensuring no German soldiers remained hidden. Henderson kicked open the door to a basement and found 7 children huddled in the darkness. The oldest perhaps 12 years old, the youngest no more than 3. They were alone, no adults visible, and they were clearly starving. The children recoiled from Henderson in terror when they saw his uniform, pressing themselves against the far wall of the basement. The oldest girl held the youngest child protectively, her eyes wide with fear. Henderson stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, looking at these terrified children, and felt something break inside him. He had joined the army at 18, had fought across France and Belgium and into Germany, had become hardened by combat in ways he could never have imagined. But looking at these children, he could not maintain the emotional distance that survival in war required. They were just kids. They had not invaded Poland or bombed London or built the camps. They were just kids who were going to starve to death in a basement because the world around them had gone insane. Henderson lowered his rifle and backed out of the basement. He found his sergeant and reported the children. The sergeant, a veteran from the Italian campaign named Thompson, came to look. He stood in the basement doorway for a long moment, then turned to Henderson. "Round up the squad," he said quietly. "Everyone contributes 1 ration can. We leave them here. Tell no one else. If anyone asks, we found the basement empty." Henderson nodded and moved through the building to find the other 7 members of their squad. Not everyone agreed immediately. One soldier, whose brother had been killed at Caen, argued that these were German kids, that their fathers had probably killed Canadians, that they did not deserve Canadian food. But Thompson cut him off. "I am not asking your opinion," he said. "I am giving you an order, 1 can per man. Now." The edge in his voice made clear this was not negotiable. Each soldier removed 1 can from his pack and added it to the pile. 8 cans total, enough to keep 7 children alive for several days. Thompson carried the cans back into the basement. Himself set them down where the children could reach them, then backed out without saying anything. There was nothing to say that would bridge the vast gulf between his world and theirs. The children did not touch the cans until after the Canadians had left the building. When they finally did, when the oldest girl opened the first can with shaking hands and smelled actual food, she began crying. The younger children did not understand why she was crying and started crying themselves. They ate the food carefully, rationing it with the discipline of people who had known hunger for a long time. 3 days later, when British military government officials finally arrived to process civilians, they found the children still in the basement, alive because of 8 cans of Canadian Army rations shared by soldiers who had every reason to hate them and instead chose mercy. Stories like this spread through the Canadian units in Germany, shared in quiet conversations between soldiers trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. The war was ending, that much was obvious. Germany was collapsing. The Nazi regime was in its death throes. But the soldiers on the ground had to figure out how to be occupiers, how to treat the people whose country they had conquered. The official guidance was minimal and often contradictory, so they made their own choices, guided by their own moral sense of what was right. Company Sergeant Major William Mackenzie from Nova Scotia made a choice that would have gotten him court-martialed if his superiors had known about it. His company occupied a farming village near Oldenburg in late April. The village had not been heavily damaged, but the population was starving. German authorities had requisitioned all the food for the military, and then the military had collapsed, leaving the civilians with nothing. Mackenzie toured the village and saw the situation clearly. Elderly people lying in their beds too weak from hunger to stand. Children with the distended bellies that marked severe malnutrition, a medical crisis that would result in mass death within weeks if nothing was done. Mackenzie called his platoon leaders together and outlined a plan. The company had captured a German supply dump 2 days earlier that contained several tons of dried beans and flour, low-quality rations intended for rear area troops. This was technically military property that should have been inventoried and turned over to Army logistics. Mackenzie proposed that it could instead disappear into the village, distributed to civilians who desperately needed it. This was blatantly against regulations. It was misappropriation of captured military stores. It could be interpreted as looting or theft. But Mackenzie looked at his officers and said simply, "I have seen enough death. If you want to report me, go ahead. I am doing this regardless." No one reported him. Instead, his platoon leaders organized their men to move the supplies under cover of night, distributing them to civilian homes throughout the village. The official paperwork reported that the supply dump had contained less than half of what was actually there, a discrepancy that logistics officers in the rear never questioned because German record-keeping had collapsed and nobody knew what was supposed to be where. The villagers received enough food to prevent mass starvation. Mackenzie never spoke about what he had done, considering it simply a necessary action that did not require justification or praise. He had seen a problem, had the means to solve it, and had acted accordingly. But not all Canadian soldiers felt this way. There was significant debate within the ranks about whether helping German civilians was appropriate or even moral. Many soldiers argued that Germans had brought this suffering upon themselves, that they had supported Hitler enthusiastically when he was winning, and that they deserved to experience the consequences of their choices. These soldiers pointed out that German civilians had not objected when Jews were being deported, when concentration camps were being built, when Germany was conquering Europe. The sudden helplessness and victimhood of German civilians in 1945 felt like selective amnesia, a convenient forgetting of their own complicity in Nazi crimes. Corporal James Morrison from Toronto was one of the soldiers who struggled with these questions. He had landed in Normandy, fought through France and Belgium, and entered Germany with the 3rd Canadian Division. In early May, his unit liberated a labor camp near Bremen, where slave laborers from across Europe had been worked to death in armaments factories. Morrison walked through the camp seeing human beings reduced to walking skeletons, seeing bodies stacked like cordwood, seeing evidence of cruelty so systematic it defied comprehension. The camp guards had fled, but German civilians from the nearby town were brought in by British officers to see what had been happening in their community. Morrison watched the civilians claim ignorance, saying they had not known, had not understood what was happening at the camp. He watched them cry and claim shock, as if the trains full of prisoners arriving regularly could somehow have been invisible, as if the smoke from the crematorium could somehow have gone unnoticed. His anger at this performance of ignorance was visceral and overwhelming. These people had known. they had chosen not to see because seeing would have required action or at least moral discomfort. Now they wanted to be treated as innocent victims of a regime they had supported and enabled. 3 days later, Morrison was on patrol in a town near Hamburg when he encountered an old man begging for food. The man was thin and weak, clearly hungry, and he approached Morrison with desperate pleading. Morrison's immediate instinct was to walk past, to ignore this man who had lived in Nazi Germany, who had probably voted for Hitler, who had certainly benefited from German conquests. But he found himself stopping, found himself reaching into his pack, found himself handing over a ration can, despite his anger and his conviction that this man deserved nothing. The old man took the can with shaking hands and thanked Morrison in German that Morrison did not understand but whose gratitude was unmistakable. Morrison walked away confused and angry at himself. Why had he helped? He still believed the man was complicit, still believed German civilians bore responsibility for Nazi crimes. But confronted with immediate human need, with an old man who was starving in front of him, Morrison had found he could not withhold help. The complexity of this moment, the tension between justified anger and basic human compassion, would stay with Morrison for the rest of his life. He never resolved it completely, never found a clean answer to whether he had done the right thing. But he knew that in that moment he had chosen to see a human being rather than an enemy, and that choice had mattered. The pattern repeated across the Canadian occupation zones in Germany throughout the spring and summer of 1945. Individual soldiers making individual choices about how to treat civilians they encountered. Some maintained strict discipline and offered no help. Some gave away rations freely to anyone who asked. Most fell somewhere in between, helping when the need was obviously desperate, when the civilians were clearly vulnerable, when their own conscience would not allow them to walk past human suffering, regardless of nationality or political history. What made the Canadian response distinctive compared to other Allied forces was the particular nature of Canadian military culture. The Canadian Army in 1945 was largely composed of volunteers who had enlisted for idealistic reasons, who genuinely believed they were fighting for freedom and democracy against fascism. This idealism had been battered by years of brutal combat, but it had not been entirely destroyed. Many Canadian soldiers still carried with them a sense that they were supposed to represent something better than what they were fighting against. Showing mercy to defeated enemies, helping civilians who were suffering, these actions were ways of proving to themselves that they were still the good guys, despite everything the war had forced them to do. There was also a practical element. Canadian soldiers understood that they would be occupying Germany for an indefinite period. Creating conditions where civilians died en masse from starvation would make occupation more difficult and dangerous. It would breed resentment and resistance. It would create public health crises that could spread disease to occupying forces. Helping civilians survive was not just morally right, it was strategically sensible. A population that had been shown mercy was less likely to engage in sabotage or resistance than a population that had been brutalized. The Canadian Military Command eventually recognized what was happening at the ground level and issued guidance that reflected the reality of soldier behavior. In early May, orders came down clarifying that emergency humanitarian assistance to prevent starvation was permitted within the limits of available resources, but that this should not extend to fraternization or social relationships with German civilians. This guidance essentially ratified what soldiers were already doing while maintaining the official policy of non-fraternization. It was a characteristically Canadian compromise, acknowledging practical realities while preserving formal rules. But the most powerful impact of Canadian food sharing was not on military operations or occupation policy. It was on German civilian understanding of who had defeated them. For 12 years, Germans had been told that they were the master race, that their enemies were subhuman and barbaric, that surrender would mean enslavement or death. The experience of being treated with basic human decency by the armies that had conquered Germany fundamentally challenged this narrative. When Canadian soldiers gave away their own food to starving German civilians, they were delivering a more powerful ideological message than any propaganda could convey. Margaret Hoffman, the old woman from Frisoith, who received 3 cans from a Canadian private on April 19th, spent the rest of her life trying to reconcile what had happened to her with what she had been told would happen. The Canadians who occupied her town for 3 months were not monsters. They were young men, most of them kind, or at least not cruel, who shared their cigarettes and their chocolate bars with German children, who helped repair damaged buildings, who treated civilians with a rough courtesy that seemed impossibly generous given the circumstances. Margaret's youngest son eventually returned from captivity, having been taken prisoner by British forces during the final battle. He was alive and unharmed because his captors had chosen not to execute prisoners despite having every military justification to do so. Margaret lived until 1986, long enough to see Germany reunified and prosperous again. In her final years, she would tell her grandchildren about the war and the occupation. She would describe the terror of watching foreign soldiers enter her town, the certainty that she was about to die or worse. And then she would describe the young Canadian private who left 3 cans of food on her doorstep and walked away. That moment, she would say, was when she began to understand that everything she had been told was lies. The enemies were not monsters. Her own government had been the monsters. The realization had been devastating and liberating at the same time, a forced reckoning with complicity and propaganda that shaped how she understood herself and her country for the rest of her life. The Canadian soldiers, who gave away their food, rarely spoke about it afterward. It was not the kind of war story that sounded heroic or exciting. It did not involve enemy defeats or brave charges or narrow escapes from death. It was just quiet mercy extended to people who had recently been enemies and might have been again under different circumstances. Many soldiers felt uncomfortable with praise for these actions, feeling that basic human decency should not require special recognition. They had simply seen people who needed help and had chosen to help within the limited means available to them. That they were praised for this revealed more about how low expectations had fallen than about how remarkable their actions were. But to the German civilians who received that help, the actions were miraculous and transformative. They were proof that humanity could persist even in the chaos and brutality of war. They were demonstrations that not everyone would choose vengeance when they had the power to inflict it. They were evidence that the ideology of hatred and racial supremacy that had driven the Nazi regime was not universal, that other ways of seeing the world existed and had ultimately proven stronger. The Canadian soldiers who shared their rations did not think they were delivering ideological messages. They were just trying to keep people from starving. But their choices communicated more powerfully than any formal program of re-education could have about what democracy and human rights actually meant in practice. The food sharing also created individual relationships that lasted long beyond the occupation. There are documented cases of Canadian soldiers who maintained correspondence with German families they had helped, relationships that persisted for decades. Children who received Canadian rations in 1945 grew up to visit Canada, to learn English, to develop connections with the country whose soldiers had shown them mercy when they were most vulnerable. These individual connections became threads that helped weave together former enemies into something resembling friendship, or at least mutual understanding. The story of Canadian soldiers sharing their food with German civilians is not a story about saints or heroes. It is a story about ordinary people making difficult moral choices in extraordinary circumstances. The soldiers who shared their rations were not perfect. Many of them harbored prejudices and anger. Many struggled with whether helping Germans was the right choice. Many gave help grudgingly or with reservations. But they gave help nonetheless, and that choice mattered enormously to the people who received it. In a war that had been defined by industrial-scale cruelty and systematic dehumanization, small acts of kindness became revolutionary. They proved that individuals could still choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over hatred, humanity over ideology. The legacy of these choices extends to the present day. Germany and Canada developed a strong relationship in the post-war years, built partly on the foundation of how Canadian occupation forces had treated German civilians. The memory of Canadian soldiers sharing their rations became part of German collective memory about the occupation, remembered as evidence that the Allies, while conquerors, were not barbaric or cruel. This memory made reconciliation easier, made Germans more willing to accept responsibility for Nazi crimes without feeling that collective punishment was being inflicted. The Canadians had shown that judgment and mercy could coexist, that holding Germany accountable did not require treating individual Germans as less than human. For Canada, the story became part of national mythology about Canadian values in action. Canadians have long defined themselves in contrast to more powerful neighbors, emphasizing peacekeeping and humanitarianism as distinctly Canadian virtues. The image of Canadian soldiers sharing their own food with starving enemy civilians fit perfectly into this self-conception, providing evidence that Canada brought something distinctive to international affairs beyond just military power. Whether this mythology accurately represents Canadian behavior in all contexts is debatable, but the specific instance of food sharing in Germany in 1945 is well documented and genuine. The ultimate truth revealed by this story is about the persistence of human decency even in conditions designed to destroy it. War creates situations where cruelty is easy and kindness is difficult, where hatred is encouraged and compassion is viewed with suspicion. The fact that Canadian soldiers chose mercy anyway, that they gave away their own food to people they had been fighting against, demonstrates that basic human values can survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. This is not a comfortable truth because it implies responsibility. If soldiers in 1945 could choose kindness in the midst of total war, then everyone in every time period bears responsibility for the choices they make about how to treat other human beings. There are no circumstances terrible enough to excuse cruelty, no situations so extreme that decency becomes impossible. The Canadian soldiers proved this simply by sharing their rations with people who desperately needed them. That simple act of sharing, repeated hundreds of times across the ruins of Nazi Germany, showed that humanity could persist where everything else had failed. That lesson remains as vital today as it was in the spring of 1945, a reminder that the choice to be decent always exists, even when every incentive suggests choosing otherwise. The Canadian soldiers who gave away their food made that choice. In doing so, they showed not just mercy to former enemies, but also what was possible when people decided that being human mattered more than being victorious.